August 7th, 1944, Normandy. Night settles low over the rolling farmland south of Caen, heavy with dust and the lingering smell of cordite. The heat of the day has not yet faded. Engines idle in darkness, their shapes barely visible beneath camouflage nets and drifting smoke. British and Canadian troops wait in silence, pressed inside armored hulls and shallow slit trenches, listening to the distant thud of artillery adjusting its range. Above them, the sky is busy, but unseen. Bombers forming, navigation lights masked, crews aligning on landmarks memorized in daylight and rehearsed for weeks. For the German defenders, this sector has become familiar ground. They have fought here for months. They know the hedgerows, the villages, the killing zones. They expect daylight assaults, methodical advances, pauses to regroup. Tonight feels wrong. The air vibrates with preparation, but nothing moves yet. No probing patrols, no warning shots, just a tightening pressure that cannot be measured. Within hours, the battlefield south of Caen will no longer feel stable. And by morning, German commanders will be forced to confront a reality they did not expect, one that spreads faster than any advance on a map, through reports, reactions, and sudden doubt. If this moment stayed with you, comment below, like, and subscribe for more true World War II stories. By early August 1944, the war in Western Europe had reached a point of dangerous tension for both sides. Nearly 2 months had passed since Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6th, and the promise of a swift breakout had dissolved into a grinding attritional struggle. The beaches were secure. The ports were slowly coming online. But inland, progress was measured in hedgerows, villages, and casualty lists. For the British and Canadian armies fighting east of the Allied lodgment, the objective of Caen, originally intended to fall on D-Day, had turned into a prolonged contest of endurance. Caen itself lay battered and broken, much of it already in Allied hands after weeks of bombing and street fighting. Yet south of the city, the German army still held firm. The high ground beyond Caen, the open rolling terrain leading toward Falaise, remained under German control. From these positions, German armored divisions continued to threaten any Allied attempt at a decisive breakout. As long as this line held, the Allied front remained compressed, vulnerable, and slow to maneuver. For the German command in Normandy, this sector had become the anchor of their defense. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, understood that if the Allies broke through here, the entire German position in France could unravel. Panzer divisions, already depleted but still formidable, were concentrated east of the Orne River, facing British and Canadian forces. These units had been fed into the battle piece by piece since June, ordered to hold ground at almost any cost. Their continued resistance was as much about morale as it was about terrain. German confidence in this sector rested on several assumptions. First, that Allied forces were predictable. British and Canadian attacks so far had followed a familiar pattern: heavy preparatory bombing, followed by cautious armored advances and infantry consolidation. Second, that German defensive doctrine, elastic defense backed by armored counterattacks, could continue to blunt Allied momentum. And third, that night operations on a large scale remained beyond Allied capability, especially when armor was involved. These beliefs, reinforced by weeks of costly but successful defensive fighting, created a dangerous sense of stability. On the Allied side, patience was wearing thin. The Americans, fighting to the west, had finally achieved a breakthrough with Operation Cobra in late July, shattering the German front near Saint-Lô. Their rapid advance threatened to outflank the entire German position in Normandy. This shift placed new pressure on British and Canadian commanders. If they failed to push south from Caen, German forces could disengage from the Eastern Front and redeploy against the American advance. What had once been a holding battle was now a race against time. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding all Allied ground forces in Normandy, recognized the moment clearly. The role of British and Canadian forces had always been to fix German armor in the east, preventing it from opposing the American breakout. But now, fixation was no longer enough. A decisive blow was needed, one that would not only break through German lines, but also shatter the enemy's confidence in their ability to control the battlefield south of Caen. Canadian forces, in particular, were under intense pressure. Having taken over much of the Caen front, the 1st Canadian Army faced hardened German divisions that had already absorbed months of combat. Casualties were high, progress was slow, yet the Canadians were now being asked to play a central role in an operation that demanded speed, coordination, and innovation on a scale they had not yet attempted in Normandy. The battlefield itself shaped every decision. Unlike the hedgerow country to the west, the terrain south of Caen was more open, rolling fields, long sight lines, and fewer natural obstacles. This favored armor, but it also exposed attackers to German anti-tank guns and well-sighted defensive positions. Any daylight assault risked immediate detection and heavy losses. Any pause allowed German commanders to react, redeploy, and counterattack. The margin for error was narrowing. By the first week of August, both sides sensed that something was about to give. German units reported increased Allied air activity, unusual concentrations of armor, and changes in artillery patterns. Allied intelligence, meanwhile, confirmed that German morale, while still disciplined, was under strain. Units were tired, replacements were scarce, fuel and ammunition shortages were growing, yet none of this suggested collapse. If anything, it reinforced the belief among German commanders that stubborn defense could still stabilize the front. It was within this tightening strategic vice, American forces surging westward, British and Canadian forces preparing in the east, and German commanders clinging to a shrinking defensive line, that the conditions for a radically different kind of operation emerged. One that aimed not just to advance the front, but to do something far more disruptive, to strike so suddenly and in such an unexpected way that German confidence itself would become a casualty. And to understand how that plan took shape, attention must turn from the wider battlefield to the details of preparation, force composition, and intent that followed. In the days that followed the shifting of momentum in Normandy, Allied planning accelerated with a new sense of urgency. The breakthrough achieved by American forces in the West had created an opportunity that could not be wasted. German units east of the Allied front were now exposed to the risk of encirclement, but only if British and Canadian forces could break through south of Caen and drive toward Falaise. The task was no longer simply to hold German armor in place. It was to unbalance it completely. The operation that emerged from this pressure was designed to do more than gain ground. It was conceived as a shock. Allied planners understood that German defenses south of Caen were layered, experienced, and deeply entrenched. A conventional daylight assault, even with overwhelming firepower, would likely result in another costly advance measured in hundreds of yards. Instead, they began to consider a method that exploited one of the few remaining asymmetries: the Allies' growing mastery of air power, navigation, and large-scale coordination after dark. The plan called for a night attack involving massed armor, infantry, artillery, and air support, a combination the German army did not expect to face in darkness. British and Canadian commanders were fully aware of the risks. Night operations with armored formations had long been considered hazardous, prone to confusion, misidentification, and breakdown in command and control. Yet those same risks also offered opportunity. If confusion could be managed on one side, it could be imposed on the other. The core of the ground force would be British and Canadian armored divisions, supported by infantry formations tasked with securing key villages, crossroads, and high ground. These were not fresh units. Many had been fighting since June, absorbing losses and learning hard lessons in Normandy's unforgiving terrain. Their commanders understood the battlefield intimately, not through maps alone, but through repeated contact with German defenses that had proven resilient and deadly. Artillery planning became central to the operation. Guns were positioned with meticulous care, their firing plans synchronized down to the minute. The intent was not simply to destroy German positions, but to isolate them, cutting communication lines, suppressing movement, and creating the illusion of multiple threats unfolding at once. Counter-battery fire was prioritized, aiming to neutralize German guns before they could respond effectively to the ground advance. Air power added another dimension. Heavy bombers, more commonly associated with strategic targets deep in Germany, were assigned a tactical role. Their task was to strike German positions immediately ahead of the advancing ground forces, using overwhelming explosive force to rupture defensive cohesion. This decision was controversial. Previous experiences had shown that bombing close to friendly troops carried serious risks, but the scale of the effort was intended to leave German defenders disoriented, deafened, and unable to re-establish control before armored units arrived. Secrecy surrounded every stage of preparation. Movement orders were restricted. Units advanced to assembly areas under cover of darkness, often using secondary roads to avoid aerial observation. Camouflage was reinforced. Wireless silence was imposed where possible. Even among Allied troops, knowledge of the full scope of the operation was limited. What mattered most was execution at the moment of contact, not complete understanding beforehand. On the German side, there were warning signs, but no clear picture. Intelligence reports noted increased Allied air activity and unusual concentrations of armor. Yet German commanders interpreted these indicators through the lens of previous experience. They expected another set-piece attack, preceded by daylight bombing and followed by cautious advances. The idea that the Allies would attempt a large-scale armored thrust at night, supported by heavy bombers, did not align with established assumptions about Allied doctrine. This misreading was reinforced by fatigue. German divisions in the Caen sector had been in near-constant combat for weeks. Commanders were managing depleted units, stretched supply lines, and growing shortages of fuel and ammunition. Morale remained disciplined, but it was brittle, sustained by routine and the belief that familiar defensive methods would continue to work. By the evening of August 7th, the pieces were in place. British and Canadian units waited in concealed positions south and east of Caen. Artillery crews stood by their guns, watches synchronized. Air crews prepared for low-altitude night bombing runs over a battlefield crowded with friendly forces. The plan demanded precision, restraint, and nerve. What followed would test not only equipment and training, but assumptions about what was possible, about who held the initiative, and about how quickly confidence could unravel when those assumptions proved wrong. And to see how that unraveling began, the operation must now be examined through the different angles from which it was experienced. For the soldiers and tank crews waiting in the darkness south of Caen, the operation did not begin as a grand maneuver on a map. It began as a series of small, controlled actions carried out under immense pressure. Inside armored vehicles, men sat shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by the smell of oil, hot metal, and cordite. Visibility was limited to narrow vision slits and faint outlines beyond the hull. Orders were brief and repeated until memorized. There would be no time for clarification once movement began. In the absence of light, discipline and routine became the only anchors. Infantry units tasked with advancing alongside the armor faced a different kind of strain. Moving at night meant navigating open ground and ruined villages with minimal visual reference. Landmarks identified in daylight vanished into shadow. Each step carried the risk of straying into minefields, defensive wire, or overlapping fields of fire. Yet these troops had learned, through months of fighting, how German positions were typically organized. That familiarity provided a measure of confidence, even as uncertainty pressed in from every direction. From a tactical standpoint, the assault unfolded as a deliberate attempt to overwhelm German defenses before they could react coherently. Armored columns moved along carefully selected axes, guided by compass bearings and pre-marked routes. Engineers worked ahead of the main force, clearing obstacles and marking safe passages with subdued lights, visible only at close range. The goal was not speed for its own sake, but continuity, maintaining forward momentum so that German units had no opportunity to regroup or establish new defensive lines. Artillery played a constant role. Its presence felt even when guns fell silent. Prearranged fire missions were triggered by time rather than direct observation, a necessity in darkness. German strongpoints were engaged not when they revealed themselves, but when Allied planners predicted they would exist. This methodical approach reduced the need for immediate adjustments and limited the confusion that often plagued night fighting. For German soldiers on the receiving end, the experience was profoundly disorienting. Defensive positions that had been carefully prepared over weeks were suddenly subjected to intense bombardment without the familiar warning signs of an approaching assault. The absence of clear visual cues made it difficult to assess the scale of the attack. Was this a raid, a probing action, or something far larger? Reports sent up the chain of command reflected this uncertainty, often contradicting one another in the crucial early hours. German tactical doctrine relied heavily on local initiative and rapid counterattack, particularly by armored reserves. But at night, these responses were slowed or paralyzed. Movement without clear identification risked fratricide. Communication between units broke down as telephone lines were cut and radio traffic became congested. The cohesion that had defined German defensive success in Normandy began to erode, not through collapse, but through hesitation. At the human level, morale was shaped by perception as much as by loss. Allied troops, advancing steadily through positions that were expected to resist more fiercely, sensed that something was different. Resistance was uneven. Some German positions fought hard and held until overwhelmed. Others fell silent abruptly, their occupants withdrawn or displaced by the violence around them. Each cleared position reinforced the belief that the plan was working. For German defenders, the opposite effect took hold. The night offered no reassurance. Without daylight to restore orientation, the battle felt unbounded, unfolding everywhere at once. The usual rhythms of defense, identify, respond, counterattack, no longer applied cleanly. Confidence, built over weeks of predictable engagements, began to slip, replaced by a growing awareness that the rules had changed. And while these human and tactical experiences defined the ground-level reality of the operation, they were only part of the picture. Above and beyond the immediate fight lay other forces at work: technological choices, leadership decisions, and enemy reactions that would shape how this night came to be remembered. The technological dimension of the operation was not defined by a single breakthrough, but by the careful integration of systems that had matured over the course of the war. Allied armored units were now equipped with more reliable radios, allowing commanders to maintain contact across dispersed formations even in darkness. This did not eliminate confusion, but it reduced the isolation that had plagued earlier night operations. Navigation aids, ranging from simple luminous markings to more advanced aerial guidance techniques, helped align movement with planning in a way that German forces could not easily match. Air power, once again, played a decisive supporting role. Heavy bombers and medium aircraft were used in a tightly constrained window, striking known and suspected German positions ahead of the ground advance. The objective was not precision in the modern sense, but effect. The explosions disrupted command posts, collapsed field fortifications, and severed lines of communication. For German units accustomed to daylight air attacks that could be anticipated and endured, the sudden violence from above during the night added a layer of psychological shock. Leadership decisions at multiple levels shaped how this technology was applied. Allied commanders accepted a level of risk that would have been unthinkable earlier in the campaign. They trusted subordinate leaders to operate with initiative once the plan was set in motion. This trust was reinforced by extensive rehearsals and clear intent. Units were not simply told where to go, but why their objectives mattered in the larger design. That understanding allowed local commanders to adapt when conditions diverged from expectations. At the higher command level, restraint proved just as important as aggression. Orders emphasized consolidation after key objectives were taken, rather than reckless pursuit. This approach limited exposure to German counterattacks and preserved momentum for the next phase of the advance. It reflected a growing maturity in Allied command culture, one that balanced ambition with control. From the German perspective, the operation struck at a moment of mounting strain. Technologically, German units were increasingly disadvantaged. Fuel shortages restricted the movement of armored reserves. Radar and air defense assets were stretched thin, unable to provide reliable early warning against night bombing. Communication infrastructure, already damaged by weeks of combat, proved vulnerable under concentrated attack. Leadership challenges compounded these material problems. German commanders in the Caen sector were operating under rigid directives that emphasized holding ground over flexible maneuver. Requests for withdrawal or repositioning required approval that was often delayed or denied. As reports filtered in during the night, fragmented, incomplete, and sometimes alarming, commanders struggled to form a coherent picture of events. Decisions made in uncertainty tended to err on the side of caution, further slowing response. Morale, though rarely mentioned explicitly in official German reports, was clearly affected by this convergence of factors. Units that had previously relied on predictable Allied behavior now faced an enemy willing to exploit darkness, coordination, and overwhelming force simultaneously. The psychological effect was cumulative. Each unanswered report, each failed counterattack, each sudden loss of contact reinforced the sense that control was slipping away. By the early hours, it became apparent to German leadership that this was not a localized action. Defensive plans built around daylight engagements and limited night activity no longer applied. The enemy had demonstrated a capability that undermined fundamental assumptions about the battle. That realization set the stage for the decisive phase to follow. What began as uncertainty would soon harden into recognition, as the operation reached the moment where its true impact could no longer be contained by defensive doctrine or expectation. Shortly after midnight, the scale of the operation became unmistakable. The earlier bombardment, violent but contained, gave way to sustained pressure along a widening front south of Caen. Armored columns advanced through gaps that had been opened not just by explosives, but by dislocation. German positions that should have offered coordinated resistance responded in fragments. Isolated gunfire here, delayed movement there, commands issued too late to shape events. British and Canadian tanks pushed forward with measured determination, maintaining spacing and alignment despite the darkness. Their movement was not reckless. It was deliberate, guided by planning that anticipated resistance rather than reacting to it. Infantry followed close behind, clearing bypassed strongpoints and securing villages whose names had been studied for weeks and now emerged suddenly from the night, half-ruined and silent. By the early hours of August 8th, reports reaching German headquarters began to converge on a troubling conclusion. This was not a diversion. It was not a limited thrust. Multiple armored formations were moving south simultaneously, supported by artillery that continued to suppress any attempt at organized counteraction. German units attempting to reposition found roads cratered or blocked, their movements exposed to air attack and artillery fire even in darkness. Attempts to mount counterattacks revealed the depth of the disruption. Panzer units, long considered the decisive element of German defense in Normandy, struggled to assemble. Fuel shortages limited readiness. Night movement increased the risk of mechanical failure and friendly fire. Orders issued from higher command arrived late or contradicted one another as the situation evolved faster than the reporting system could track. At the front, German soldiers sensed the change before it was fully acknowledged by their commanders. Defensive lines that had held through weeks of fighting were no longer intact. Gaps widened as units withdrew or were overrun. The familiar rhythm of engagement, identify the enemy, fix his position, counterattack, collapsed into a series of disconnected local actions with no unifying direction. Allied commanders, receiving more coherent reports from their advancing units, recognized the opportunity and the danger simultaneously. The temptation to accelerate was balanced against the risk of overextension. Orders emphasized maintaining contact between formations and securing flanks, even as the advance pressed deeper into German-held territory. This discipline preserved the integrity of the assault at the moment when momentum was at its peak. As dawn approached, the battlefield revealed the consequences of the night. Smoke hung low over the fields. Wrecked vehicles marked positions where resistance had been strongest. Prisoners were gathered in numbers that exceeded expectations, many of them exhausted and disoriented. The German front south of Caen had not simply been pushed back. It had been unsettled in a way that could not be easily reversed. Yet the most significant effects were not measured in ground gained or equipment lost. They lay in the realization spreading through German command channels that their assumptions about Allied limitations, about the reliability of night as a shield, about the predictability of the enemy, were no longer valid. That realization would shape every decision made in the hours that followed. And as the morning light exposed the full extent of the breakthrough, the operation entered its second, equally decisive phase, one defined not just by movement on the map, but by the psychological impact of what had already occurred. By mid-morning on August 8th, the consequences of the night's fighting could no longer be confined to the front line. German command posts across the Normandy theater were receiving a steady flow of reports describing lost positions, disrupted units, and advancing Allied armor moving faster than anticipated. What made these reports unsettling was not their content alone, but their tone. They reflected uncertainty rather than control. Phrases indicating incomplete information, broken contact, and unclear enemy strength appeared with increasing frequency. German commanders attempted to restore coherence by ordering local countermeasures, but these efforts exposed the depth of the problem. Units designated for counterattack were either unavailable, under strength, or unable to move in time. Roads leading south of Caen were congested with retreating elements, damaged vehicles, and displaced supply columns. Air superiority ensured that any daylight movement risked immediate attack, reinforcing paralysis rather than resolve. Within frontline units, the effect was immediate and corrosive. Soldiers who had endured weeks of hard fighting now faced an enemy that seemed to operate beyond familiar constraints. The sense of mastery gained through experience, knowing how Allied attacks usually unfolded, was gone. Instead, there was the growing belief that defenses could be bypassed or overwhelmed without warning. This perception spread rapidly, amplified by rumors and the visible signs of disintegration around them. The reaction at higher levels of command revealed a shift in priorities. Orders increasingly focused on stabilizing lines rather than reclaiming lost ground. Defensive positions were pulled back to reduce exposure. Requests for reinforcements multiplied, even as resources dwindled. In some sectors, German commanders began to authorize withdrawals that would have been unthinkable days earlier, recognizing that holding exposed ground invited further collapse. Allied intelligence intercepted fragments of this response almost in real time. Signals traffic indicated confusion and urgency within German formations. Reports from reconnaissance units confirmed that resistance was thinning in areas beyond the initial breakthrough. What had been designed as a tactical operation was now producing operational effects, reshaping the behavior of the enemy across a broader front. For Allied troops on the ground, these changes manifested as opportunity tempered by caution. Advancing units encountered fewer coordinated defenses, but remained alert to the possibility of sudden, violent resistance from isolated German formations. The knowledge that morale was wavering did not reduce the danger, but it altered expectations. The enemy was still capable, but no longer certain. By the end of the day, the psychological dimension of the operation had become impossible to ignore. German morale, previously sustained by discipline and routine, had suffered a shock from which it could not easily recover. Confidence in the defensive system south of Caen was broken, replaced by a reactive posture that ceded initiative to the Allies. This shift did not mark the end of fighting, nor did it guarantee immediate victory, but it changed the character of the campaign. The Germans were no longer dictating the terms of engagement in this sector, and as the implications of that realization spread, the operation's aftermath began to take shape, not just in territory gained, but in the long shadow it cast over the remainder of the Normandy battle. In the days that followed the operation, the material consequences became clearer as front lines stabilized long enough for assessment. British and Canadian forces had advanced several miles south of Caen, capturing key terrain that had resisted earlier efforts for weeks. Villages and road networks critical to German movement were now in Allied hands, opening routes toward Falaise and compressing the German defensive footprint in Normandy. Casualty figures reflected the intensity of the fighting. Allied losses were significant. particularly among armored units exposed during the advance. Tanks destroyed or disabled littered the approach routes, testimony to German anti-tank defenses that had not disappeared entirely. Yet German losses were heavier in proportion and more damaging in effect. Large numbers of prisoners were taken, many from units that had been expected to fight to exhaustion rather than surrender. Equipment losses, especially in vehicles and artillery, further degraded German combat capability in the sector. Perhaps more consequential than numbers alone was the disruption of German unit cohesion. Divisions that had once operated with clear internal structure emerged fragmented. Battalions were reduced to improvised groups. Command relationships blurred as officers struggled to reassemble forces under constant pressure from Allied air and artillery. This loss of cohesion could not be quickly repaired, particularly given the ongoing American advance to the west. Strategically, the operation achieved its primary objective. German armored reserves remained tied down east of the Allied front, unable to disengage and counter the American breakout. The window of opportunity created by earlier Allied successes was widened rather than closed. German attempts to stabilize the situation south of Caen absorbed resources that might otherwise have been used to defend against encirclement. Reports from German headquarters acknowledged the seriousness of the situation in restrained language. References to temporary setbacks and necessary adjustments masked deeper concern. The rapidity with which the situation had deteriorated challenged assumptions about the reliability of German defensive doctrine under sustained, coordinated pressure. Morale, though seldom quantified, was clearly a factor shaping these assessments. For the Allies, the operation reinforced confidence in combined arms coordination under difficult conditions. Lessons learned about night movement, communication, and integration of air power were recorded and disseminated. Commanders recognized that such operations demanded careful planning and carried high risk, but they also demonstrated that German defenses could be broken in ways that minimized prolonged attritional fighting. As attention turned toward exploitation and consolidation, it became evident that the effects of the operation extended beyond the immediate battlefield. The balance of initiative in Normandy had shifted decisively. German forces were now reacting to Allied moves rather than shaping them, a reversal with implications that would unfold in the weeks ahead. And as the front continued to move south and east, the longer-term consequences of that shift began to emerge, altering not just positions on the map, but the strategic options available to both sides. As August progressed, the deeper effects of the operation became increasingly apparent. The German defensive system in Normandy, already strained, entered a phase of continuous contraction. Positions once considered anchors were abandoned to avoid encirclement. Units that had been expected to hold ground indefinitely were reassigned to improvised rear-guard actions, trading space for time in an effort to delay what now seemed inevitable. The loss of confidence south of Caen accelerated a broader collapse in German operational coherence. Commanders who had previously relied on counterattacks to restore balance now lacked the means and, increasingly, the belief that such actions could succeed. Fuel shortages, equipment losses, and exhausted personnel limited options. But morale played an equally decisive role. Orders to hold or counterattack were obeyed, yet often without conviction, and sometimes too late to influence events. Allied exploitation followed methodically rather than recklessly. British and Canadian forces continued to press south, coordinating their advances with American units driving eastward. The pincer that would soon close near Falaise took shape not as a sudden maneuver, but as the cumulative result of earlier decisions that had denied the Germans recovery time. The psychological shock delivered in early August ensured that German reactions remained fragmented during this critical period. Within German command circles, retrospective assessments began to identify the operation as a turning point. While official communications avoided emotive language, internal evaluations acknowledged that the Allies had demonstrated an unexpected level of adaptability. The ability to conduct large-scale, coordinated night operations undermined long-standing assumptions about Allied limitations. Defensive doctrine that depended on predictability and daylight control was no longer sufficient. For the Canadian Army, the operation carried lasting significance. It marked a transition from costly frontal fighting to a role defined by operational impact. Canadian formations, often overshadowed in broader narratives, had played a central part in breaking a key segment of the German front. This contribution reshaped perceptions within Allied command and reinforced the integration of Canadian units in subsequent planning. The broader campaign in Northwest Europe reflected these changes. German forces, once confident in their capacity to stabilize fronts through disciplined defense, were now forced into a series of reactive moves. Each withdrawal fed the next, compounding logistical strain and eroding morale further. The collapse at Falaise later in August did not emerge in isolation. It was the culmination of pressures applied earlier, when confidence had first been shaken beyond repair. By the time German units began their retreat toward the Seine, the consequences of the operation were embedded in the campaign's trajectory. What had begun as a single night of coordinated violence had altered expectations on both sides. For the Allies, it confirmed that momentum could be sustained through innovation and discipline. For the Germans, it marked the point at which recovery in Normandy ceased to be a realistic prospect. And with the battle's immediate and long-term outcomes now visible, only one element remains to be addressed: what this moment revealed about warfare itself, and why its significance endures beyond the maps and casualty figures. In the quiet that follows battle, meaning often emerges more clearly than it does in the moment of violence itself. The British and Canadian operation south of Caen was not decisive, because it destroyed an army in a single stroke, nor because it achieved an immediate, dramatic breakthrough. Its significance lay in how it changed expectations. It demonstrated that control of the battlefield is as much psychological as it is physical, and that morale can be broken not only by loss, but by surprise. For the German army in Normandy, the night of August 7 to 8, 1944, marked the end of a familiar world. Defensive routines that had held against repeated assaults no longer offered certainty. Darkness, once a shield, became a vulnerability. Confidence, sustained through discipline and experience, gave way to doubt as the enemy revealed capabilities that could not be easily countered. From that moment on, German decisions were shaped less by initiative than by reaction. For the Allies, the operation reinforced a hard-earned lesson. Success in modern warfare depended on integration of air, armor, artillery, and leadership, executed with restraint as well as force. The willingness to accept calculated risk, combined with disciplined execution, allowed British and Canadian forces to achieve effects disproportionate to the ground gained. What mattered was not how far the front moved in a single night, but how permanently the balance of momentum shifted. History often remembers great battles by their names and numbers, yet the most consequential moments are sometimes quieter, defined by a sudden loss of certainty rather than a dramatic collapse. South of Caen, morale did not shatter in a single instant. It cracked, spread, and failed under the weight of realization. From that point forward, the German position in Normandy was no longer sustainable, and in that understanding lies the enduring lesson of the operation. Wars are not only won by firepower and movement, but by the moment when one side realizes that the future it was fighting toward is no longer possible.